It is good to have you back, Jared. Last time I was in Phoenix recording with the Pool Chasers. And you probably don't know that because I know you don't listen to our own podcast if you're not in the episodes. So if you get a chance to listen to that, we didn't talk too much about you behind your back.
Good. No, you're right. I'm glad to be here for starts. I'm glad you have had fun without me. And I guess you could say I'm a pretty vain person. I only want to listen to myself talk. So you're right. I have not heard the previous episode, or it could have been the previous 10 episodes. I'm not really sure.
We know you can't read, but if you can't count, this is only episode 89.
Ooh.
So you've only missed one or two, so we're good.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad I could be here for episode 89.
The audience has been very clear. They want more Jared. So who am I to deprive our wonderful growing audience of almost 75 people now of what they really want, and that's you.
Man, we're going to have such a party when we get to 100. It could be maybe March of next year, but it's going to be awesome.
Okay, a little bit of housekeeping before getting into this 89th episode of the Rule Your Pool podcast. We are going to be teaching with Watershapes University at the International Pool and Spa Show in Las Vegas. That's just in a couple of weeks now. That'll be November 12th and 13th, teaching the Essential Plaster Workshop. That course number, you need to register ahead of time, is C3611. If you're able to be there, we would love to have you. As Jared said in a previous episode, this is for the trade. This is not for homeowners. This is for pool builders and plaster applicators primarily, or people who do a lot of startups. But we hope to see you there if you want to be in that class. We've worked pretty hard on this presentation, and it'll cover everything from shotcrete and plaster prep, plaster application and exposure, and then our part, which is the startup itself. So we got that.
Not just that, I do want to touch on some housekeeping on my end as well, Eric. And just for those of you that are listening, this is the year 2022. For the people that are listening to this podcast 50 years from now, I don't want them to try and show up to the Pool and Spa Expo in Las Vegas, November 13th, 2055, or whenever it is.
That's probably wise. Yeah.
Yeah.
By that time, we'll have at least 200 listeners.
Thanks for listening, though, 50 years from now. We really do appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we're still in the industry, that's great. If we're still alive, that's great. Anyway, this is on that same topic. And the reason we're doing this episode today is because we started getting calls about startups in cold water. Because we're getting into the fall, the temperatures are dropping, plaster crews are still applying new surfaces. How do we do startups going into the winter? There are differences. So we thought we'd do an episode about this, talking about how we would start up a pool going into the winter when we know the water temperature is still dropping. Jared, is there anything you want to add before we get into it?
The only thing I would add in here is this is going to vary by region. The temperatures are going to be very different depending on where you're located. So take that into consideration.
All right, let's get into it. Episode 89 of the Rule Your Pool podcast.
Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go.
Regardless of water temperature, the LSI is always the priority in our startup procedure. Would you agree with that, Jared, or am I wrong?
That is absolutely true, and we did do Here's to the Naysayers, where we covered the fact that this is a quote-unquote calcium-based startup, but it's really not. It's an LSI-based startup that happens to be built around the use of calcium being introduced to the pool as it's being filled.
And the main variable that we're doing this episode about is water temperature. That is a factor to the LSI that matters a lot. And it's not so much just the water temperature the day you fill the pool. It's where is the water temperature going to be? If you're filling your pool now, we're in late October. The water's getting colder. So you have to think a little bit differently as opposed to a startup in the spring or summertime, because that water temperature is really going to dictate how high you need to make your calcium hardness. We want to err heavier on calcium going into the winter. Okay, that's the first point, because you're going to need it, especially if you have no cover or a mesh cover. You're going to have a lot of dilution, most likely, depending on where you are, I guess. But you need more calcium in your water. So always err high on calcium, err light on acid. So that's the first point. And we're going to dive into these a little deeper. The second point is activating SC1000 is a temperature-dependent reaction, and Jared and I have some differing opinions on that, but I think generally we have some consensus of how to actually apply your SC1000, because even though the amount of SC1000 is the same, how you actually pour it in is going to be different in the fall versus the rest of the year. And then finally, you're going to want to give your plaster a few extra hours to dry before you turn the water on, because how it cures is going to be a little bit different when the air temperature and the water temperature are different. So you want to just stack the odds in your favor the best way that you can. So let's take a step back and let's talk about airing heavier on calcium hardness. Now, depending on where you are in the country, normally the target is roughly 300 parts per million, but it's all in the context of the LSI. In the fall, however, Jared, what do you think we should change that to?
It's going to vary depending on your water temperature coming out of the tap and your forecasted temperature of the air. And do you think that water temperature is going to go up or down?
All right, so let's give two different examples. I'm going to say it's a pool in New Jersey, and right now the water temperature is 45, and it's going to freeze in 2 months. How much calcium do you think they should start at that pool?
I'm going at least 400 or higher.
Okay, I agree with that.
You can get it in there. You can always raise it to where you need it to be once you get it going and close it. And just so everybody understands, when we're doing a startup, we're shooting between somewhere on an LSI range on fill of 0.2 to 0.3, right? That's going to be your sweet spot. Positive 0.3, 0.2. That's your sweet spot. Well, here in Texas, we do startups in the middle of summer. The water coming out of the tap is roughly 78, 80 degrees. Well, it's 110 outside. That water's warming up as soon as you start introducing it to the pool. I will err on the side of shooting for maybe 0.22 on the lower end of that spectrum, knowing that the water temperature is going to rise. So I don't need as much calcium. And sometimes that is only 225 parts calcium that I'm trying to get to instead of 300, which, like I said before, this isn't a you need your calcium level here to make this work. No, you need your calcium level somewhere with the LSI into consideration to get it to that plus 0.2 to plus 0.3. That's it.
Right. So in New Jersey, I think we can agree it should be 400 something plus. I mean, I'd say 450 to 500 is a great area, but you don't have to do that in the first fill-up day. Like, you need to do that before you put it to bed.
And you know how we figure this out, Eric?
How?
We just pull out our trusty app here and plug the numbers in, and it'll tell us exactly what we need to do.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It'll tell you what it is, and then you can allow your pH to naturally rise up to its ceiling. So push show on your secondary readings, and it'll show you exactly how high your pH should naturally rise. What is your LSI at that point? That's what we want to know. So let your pH be higher. That's okay. Now, every time that you come to add something else, though, you need to bring that pH down just under 7.8 so that, let's say you're putting liquid chlorine in the pool. Well, if you put liquid chlorine in the pool at an 8.2 pH, it's going to cloud up. Same with cal hypo. Or if you're trying to add bicarb the second day and you have an 8.2 pH, bicarb is not going to dissolve very well. It's going to cloud up a little bit. So you want to reduce your pH just enough to get below 7.8. Then you get in your bicarb the second day. But Jared's absolutely correct. It depends on where you are and where your temperature is and where it's going to be, which is a rare thing for me to say, but he's 100% correct on this.
God, I'm so glad we record this.
Well, I may have to edit that part out. Let's move on to how we apply SC1000. This is where you and I differ a little bit, but I think that's because I'm an East Coast guy, Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and you're a Texas guy. We apparently just found out before recording this that we actually add SC1000 a little bit differently, but both are successful. So how do you do it, Jared?
I was going to say, the premise is the same. It's all about getting the product and the calcium into the pool as it's filling, and there's different variables that come into play. For example, where we are, the pH is pretty consistently high. It's always 8.0 plus every time we fill the pool up, unless you get into South Texas and well water and different variables. But let's just use my example. I want to put roughly 25% of the SC1000 required into the bowl of the pool when there's a cushion as it's filling, and then the rest of it I want to put into the barrel with the calcium and the acid to offset it, because I know that I'm going to slowly introduce it as it's filling, right? And it's just more of a, call it a slow controlled burn of introducing the chemicals, as opposed to hitting it heavy with SC1000 on the front end and waiting for it to fill. But I know you do it the opposite way.
I've got a lot more aggressive water. So you're putting a majority of SC1000 in the barrel and then neutralizing the high pH of the SC1000 against the acid and feeding it slower. and you're only putting like 25% in the bowl. See, that's interesting because it's the same amount of SC1000. So it is, in a way, it's a zero-sum game for both of us. But I'm putting in like the exact opposite. I'm going like 75% in the bowl because I've got that lower pH. I've got 40 alkalinity. I've got 40 calcium sometimes. And I want the insurance to coat the walls in the pool. And then I'm going to put like 25% in the barrel to chelate that calcium, which is plenty to chelate it. Let's be honest. You don't need a lot in there. With the acid, clear that barrel, and it overflows. And I've had success my way. You've had success your way.
You're right, because when you have a lower pH out of the tap, having a product that we're introducing like the SC1000 that has a little higher pH and it's bringing that up is beneficial, especially on the startup, as we talk about it all the time. You don't want aggressive water filling your pools. So that's why it buffers for your side. But on mine, if we were to say put all the SC1000 in the bowl as it's filling without any acid offset, because we can't get acid into the bowl of the pool as it's filling, that would not be a good thing. So we're just doing SC1000. There's a potential for calcium to fall out of solution in the bowl because it has such a high concentration or high pH, where we want that slower burn because of the 8.1, 8.2 pH out of the tap. So that's why I just prefer it in the barrel.
Well, to each their own. Now, chelating calcium ahead of time is definitely the way to go, because if, let's go back like 2-3 years when we were just learning how to do this startup. Actually, I guess it'd be 4 or 5 years now. We weren't doing that. Like, we didn't know better. We just put 100% of it in the bowl, and we had success with some pools. I had a lot of success on the East Coast, but we weren't having success in Texas because we were getting those white bowls.
Or Arizona, Southern California, you're right. And it's all about dialing in the speed of fill from the barrel, because we just had a lot of these things turned up way too fast, and they were introducing way too much calcium and way too much chemicals up front, and it was causing a problem.
And I don't have that problem here because I'm like, get it in as fast as possible, and it was working for us. So again, it's the same amount, but it depends on your tap water. It depends on your temperatures. I generally have about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit tap water out of the ground in Virginia and the Carolinas, even in the summertime. Now, it's going to get warmer in the summertime because it sits out in the sun and that water temperature rises and rises. And then you got truck fills, and that's different too. So we could just talk about this for hours, but we don't want to. Let's talk about what you're going to do in the fall. And this is somewhat universal. You're going to do it Jared's way because the water temperature dictates how fast SC1000 activates. Let's say you have 45-degree water going in. If you put SC1000 in that SC1000, yeah, it'll insulate, but it's not going to chelate. It's too cold. So you want to put about 75% of it in the barrel with the dissolving calcium, because the calcium gives off a lot of heat. That allows the SC1000 to activate just fine. And we have to remember that calcium dissolves better in cold water.
Don't forget your acid offset either.
That's right. So 12 ounces of muriatic offsets 1 quart of SC1000.
And everybody also needs to understand, in chemistry, as water temperature increases, molecular activity increases with it. As water temperature decreases, molecular activity and speed in which things happen also decrease. So that's why we're saying add it to the barrel with the calcium, because that calcium absolutely gets hot. As soon as you start dissolving calcium in the water, it's going to put off an exothermic reaction, and it's going to get warm. If you've done our startup before, you know this very well. So get it in the warm water so that it can get that activity that's required.
Right. So to summarize that, in the fall, when it's getting colder, put a majority of your SC1000 purge in the barrel or in the buckets with the dissolving calcium so it activates, and put about 25% in the pool to get that initial coating of the walls. Okay, now, the third point. We want to give the plaster some extra hours to dry before the water turns on. This is more important in cold water as well. Sorry, in cold temperatures, I should say. Cold air, cold water, because it takes a little longer for that surface to harden when it's cold out. Part of the hydration process, and it's part of the initial carbonation process, which is actually CO2 in the atmosphere starting to carbonate that surface. Studies have shown that you're going to have a better hardened surface when the water starts if you give it a few hours before you go. That is only compounded by the fact that most plaster applicators are going to put in calcium chloride as an accelerant in their plaster mix on a cold day.
They still have to stick within allowable tolerances there, just so you know that this is common practice. Yeah.
We hope no more than 2%, but some will. I mean, it's just the reality of it, but let's just hope it's below 2%. But the point is, they're more likely to do it on a cold day than a hot summer day. That takes more time, right? It accelerates faster, but you need to let that sit there for a few hours before you put water in, which ties me into the next point, unless you have something to add to that.
I do have something to add there because I just hear the naysayers in the background saying, well, I don't have time to wait. I just finished this pool. Is the plaster going to stick around for an hour, then start adding water? Probably not. And also, this depends on the type of surface you're working with as well. If you have a aggregate surface where you have rocks and pebbles, well, you should be acid washing, exposing the following day. So that's plenty of time for it to harden up and start filling it when they're done doing the exposure. But on a...
Assuming they waited a day.
Correct. But if you're doing a just normal white plaster or colored plaster, that's where this comes into play. They just finished troweling, it's set up, it's hard, it looks good. Then you should wait, right?
Yeah, I would say wait 2-3 hours.
Okay, so how do the plaster companies or the builders or the startup technicians, how do they all get on the same page to make sure that that happens?
Well, the plaster company doesn't actually do that. It's a coordination thing with the builder and the startup technician. So maybe the builder's doing the startup, or maybe they have a service company that's doing the startup. Either way, that person needs to know, and they need to be there. And they need to time it so that they can give that extra time and be ready to go, so when the water does turn on, it's added correctly.
Are you not concerned about what we call check cracks or anything like that by waiting? Obviously, you're the top level where the sun tanning ledge is and so forth. That's not going to be full for many hours, depending on how you're filling a pull up. So that's pretty standard, but I'm talking where everything else is. Is waiting a concern as far as getting it too dehydrated so that you get these check cracks?
I think we could do a future episode where we can get some people who know a lot more about that, like get a John Temple on here who would be able to explain that a little better. I'm not as concerned about check cracking on a cold day as I would be on a hot or windy day. We're trying to get it hardened. Part of the hydration process is the loss of moisture. Part of the reason that you keep a shotcrete shell wet, as we were talking with Bill Drakely, is temperature regulation. That is to your advantage in a cold day because it's already cold. So you're not losing as much moisture as fast. So I'm not as concerned about shrinkage on a cold day. Now, on a hot summer day in the direct sunlight, yeah, you're going to have some craze cracking or
depending
shrinkage
on where
cracks.
you're located, like we've discussed before. If you're in Miami or you're in South Texas or you're in Southern Arizona, Southern California,
right.
This doesn't necessarily apply to you.
Yeah, I mean, you got to use your judgment, but generally on a cold day, you have more tolerance on that. So that's going to help you in most cases. That brings me into the next thing of, because you're starting up in colder water and it's only going to get colder after you start up, there are a few things that you need to do differently. Number one, if it's a salt pool, do not add salt that fall because it's only going to get colder. Unless the coldest water temperature is going to be warm enough that your salt system can work, don't do it. You have no advantage to putting salt in your pool going into the winter. None. It'll only make your water more aggressive, and it's likely going to lead to issues like calcium crystals or winter dust because you fundamentally change the LSI in a colder temperature. To recap, if your water is going to be colder than a salt cell can actually work, don't salt it. Just wait. Okay?
Absolutely.
Number two, if the cement is ugly, let's say you have streak lines from the application or you have that puddle mark or you have whatever it is, let it be ugly. Let it be ugly all winter long. Fight the urge to get it to look good in the fall so that you can handle it correctly in the spring when the water's warming up. If you put too much acid in that pool in the fall, you are screwing over that surface. It is going to be very difficult for you to undo that damage because it never had time. Whereas, Jared, if you have an ugly surface and you're going into late October, November, and you wait until March or April, number one, it might have fixed a lot of those issues over time because it was hardening all winter anyway. And number two, in the springtime, you could just clean it up because underneath the ugly is a cured surface that looks even. See, these cosmetic issues are very surface level. If you looked at the thickness of your finger, that's about the thickness of the plaster. The damage or the discolorations is thinner than your fingernail.
Yeah, I had this call last week with a homeowner who was mad at the builder because they didn't want to assume responsibility for how the surface looked, and they wanted to blame it on the chemical management, which I don't think it was in this case. But she said it looked bad. She said there was a footprint, there were streaks, and there was this and there was that. And I was like, well, first off, some sort of combined resolution needs to be found here. I said, but no matter what you do not try to remedy this right now. And she was in the Northeast. I said, wait till the spring because it'll be better. That just gives it that much more time for the surface to harden. And if you were to rip the Band-Aid off right now and expose the surface more, because that's all we're doing with an acid wash or an acid bath, you are taking that top layer off the surface and it's going to start bleeding. Well, if it doesn't have a chance to carbonate or your LSI is not high enough to carbonate, it's just going to be bleeding all winter. That's not going to be a good thing for you or your surface or anybody involved. So I agree. Deal with it in the spring. Trust me.
Yep, absolutely. And we did a previous episode early on when we started this podcast, and it was about our startup, and I called it Cement Cures Ugly. That's episode 12, by the way, if you want to go back and listen to episode 12 of the Rule Your Pool podcast.
Her point there was, well, if I do an acid bath or an acid wash, isn't that going to degrade my surface? That's not good for my surface. And because she's listened to a few of our podcasts, and maybe she's listener 50, so she's been around for a time or two.
Yeah, for a while, yeah.
Yeah, and she brought that up because we do have a blog on acid washes and hot starts and kind of the ramification that goes with that. And I told her, I said, yes, it does. I said, but it's all about timing. If you wait long enough, sometimes these remedies of an acid bath or an acid wash are a solution, but they're not a solution within the first 30 to 60 days, in our opinion. So it's all about the timing.
You need to be thinking about the long-term life of that plaster, not the short-term cosmetics of it. Let's be honest. People don't call us with their perfect surfaces. They pretty much only call Orenda when there's a problem. We see problems all the time, and they vary. They vary in severity.
We do get a lot of complimentary emails that say thank you for your guidance.
That's true, but that's always homeowners. We never get that from the trade. The trade is always like, oh, I got a crisis. We've got a problem.
That's true.
And we see the same kind of problems all the time. So it's not like you're alone in this. But one thing seems to be universal. If you give it time, it's much easier to clean up. We have seen that across the board. We talk about this in Startup Academy. Just wait. Let the surface underneath that ugliness cure properly, and then you can always clean off the surface without opening up the pores and causing those same exact spots to come back later. It's a huge mistake that we see. We see hot starts in the fall. Well, first of all, you should never see hot starts. That's just an exposure method that's brutal. But in the fall, in the winter, it's ridiculous. You cannot undo that. So that's our opinion, but we see it all the time. We've been dealing with these problems for 5 straight years, and it's always the same story. So if you are having an ugly surface in the fall, sorry to hear it, but you're not alone. Deal with it in the spring. Okay?
There's also a concern of, well, if I increase my calcium level to 400, 450, whatever it may be in October, November, well, then I'm just going to have to manage it in March. And the answer to that is, technically, yeah, true, but you're also going to have dilution. You're going to have things that happen from now until March or April, and you're going to be dealing with and managing a different set of circumstances. And our opinion in general is calcium is not a bad thing. You can manage it accordingly.
Yeah.
So don't worry about it.
Yeah, and you're going to get dilution if you have a mesh cover and all that stuff. I mean, always air high on calcium. Always air high. Now, if you have a commercial pool with a cal hypo feeder, that's a different story. You can call us. You can reach out to us at podcast@orendatech.com or visit our help center, ask.orendatech.com. We're happy to talk to you. It's not hard to reach us. If you're listening to this and you're not sure, what path your pool should take, just ask. But when in doubt, the takeaways from this episode would be the LSI is still the most important thing, and it's not just important today, it's important all the way down to the coldest temperature and how you come out of the spring. So it's where is your pool going to be? That's where you want to know, and you want to get your calcium up to a level to support that. Number 2, get a majority of your SC1000 in with the calcium so that it chelates in the warm temperatures of that dissolving calcium, and put about 25% in the bowl, about 75% in with the calcium. And number 3, give yourself a few extra hours of drying before you turn the water on so that you give yourself the most advantage possible, even if it's ugly. And then finally, after the startup happens, no salt until the springtime. And if it's ugly, let it be ugly until the springtime. Deal with it all in the spring. It'll be a lot better for you. Jared, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
Yes. I do get some calls with customers and plaster companies and builders that will plaster a pool, say in November. The longer you can let that water circulate and run before closing it for the winter, the better.
Amen.
If you can let that thing run for 60 days or longer and you can still make it happen, let it run. Do not let it sit stagnant. Let's say you start the pool up and you want to close it down within 30 days. I'm not saying it can't be done, but there's potential problems that can come down the line because of that. Let it run as long as you possibly can.
Yes, that's great advice. I should have put that on the show notes, but you wouldn't have read them anyway.
Who needs show notes? Come on.
You know, one of these days you're going to actually write show notes, and I'm going to be so proud of you, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. Well, anyways, this has been episode 89 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. I'm your host, Eric Knight. Jared Morgan is now officially considered a host.
Yes.
Not just a co-host, but you've made it to a host status.
Thank you.
I can't believe I just said that publicly, but no, you've earned it. The fans have spoken.
I'll still be a notch below you on the host hierarchy, so don't worry. Your position is safe.
Okay. Phew. I was a little concerned. I actually only did that just to appease you so that you didn't kick me off the podcast, so thanks.
Okay, good.
All right, this has been episode 89. Thank you so much for listening, and we have been getting some great feedback from you at podcast@orendatech.com, and again, ask.orendatech.com. We continue to get feedback from you. Can't believe you're still listening to this, but we continue to get great audience suggestions for episodes. So thank you for that. Continue doing it. We are going to try to knock out some content because we are getting into trade show season. We've got the international show coming up, and then we got the holiday season, and then it is full speed ahead in the spring. So we hope to have good episodes for you. We hope that they continue to add value and that Jared one day learns how to read show notes. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.